always a week in review, week ahead outlook on a Sunday. The Sunday newspaper, if you like. The Sunday Times. Well, what a week that must be in the Sunday newspapers in the UK today. Oh my goodness. I wouldn't know what headline to go with. I mean, been in this game a long time. What would you put on the front page of the paper today? Bojo returns. But more seriously, and perhaps of much greater importance, is the events that have been happening in China over the last week. Oil prices did close on Friday solidly above that $90 floor, which seems to be the OPEC plus target. Their actions have delivered for now. Let's look at that and go to Mark Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International, close watcher of all things China. Mark, your takeaway from the week in which China has sort of coronated King Xi?
Well, it's worrying. I think what's happened, particularly in the last day, we've had basically all the officials who we were familiar with, the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the head of the central bank, have all been replaced or are going to be replaced. They're not on the central committee anymore. And that follows on from this lack of data that we've had. Now, the argument has been that officially the data couldn't be rubber stamped because everyone was tied up with the Congress. Well, yeah, this happens every 5 years. It's never happened before. All one would observe. So there seems to be a move to an even more autocratic system of government there, which is probably not particularly friendly to growth and much more friendly to security concerns. And I think that is probably despite the message that we had from Xi's speech last Sunday, I think that is probably the primary concern at this point, that China is becoming more and more worried about security issues, about its tensions with the US, about the tensions between NATO and Russia, and is moving in that direction. And I think the other big concern, I think, from the forum was there was nothing about the property sector. And it remains a huge hole. It's a big drag on growth. And one starts to wonder, and this is purely speculation, whether it's such a big problem that they don't really know what to do with it. And so they're not actually touching it, which is only going to be bad news in terms of China's overall demand for commodities. And I think those are the take-homes for me from this whole Party Congress this week.
Adi Imsirovic, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Adi, your thoughts, week in review. Oil prices held solidly above 90 after that correction wobble the previous week. The market fundamentals seem to be more in the supply concern camp now rather than demand destruction. Your thoughts on where the oil markets are at?
Well, I mean, it's been remarkably a steady week, I would say. I think there were nothing unexpected. As Mark said, we had pretty much everything. China was the big news, and quite rightly, you sort of talked about it first. But there was nothing particularly unexpected. We still have the tug of war between supply concerns, which are a big issue, particularly on the product side, because the distillates, both in the United States and Europe, are sort of fairly tight. We have issues with refineries. What really worries me at the moment is that US refineries have been running extremely high rates, and it's just a probability, even though we haven't had a hurricane season, which is a big bonus. We are having a fairly high chance of some refinery having a glitch or an issue, and then we'll have further tightness in the products market. I think I read a couple of days ago, Valero Refineries has had some recent issues and so on. So overall, that side is reasonably tight. On the other side, we have of this tug of war, we have a situation with again, recession is always there, always an issue. As Mark also, to move on, we talked about the potential of recession for quite some time, so I'm not going to repeat that. But China, what the news that came out of China, actually relatively bearish. it seems with the security being number one issue, we are very unlikely to see any big moves in terms of what's happening with the COVID zero policy. I think the name of the game is control, and even more control, which means that will impact the economy. And as Mark mentioned, the property side of things not being tackled or mentioned it is a big issue, because we still don't know, and I think we could still be talking about the Chinese subprime situation, which I think would be very, very bearish for the global economy and oil demand in general.
Mark, the dynamic in China from that point of view of this sort of show, I mean, as Adi said, and you articulated earlier, as expected happened, but my sense is that we saw a slightly more muscular tone, a more nativist tone. This weird event with the former president being escorted out of the room, was that a humiliation, or was the guy sick? I mean, it seems this takeaway of something a bit more inward looking and away from globalization than Xi had previously demonstrated. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, yes, I think that is, I mean, the way that former President Hu was treated, whatever, in Asia, basically, appearance is very important. And this is humiliation, effectively, regardless of whatever the reasons were. If he was unwell, then he should have basically been told, don't worry, you can take a rest. So, and I think it also ties in with the fact that we've seen so many people who are essentially in that camp of, or cadre of being pro-globalization in China. A lot of them have been removed. And that is significant. A much more inward-looking China. Actually, sadly, if we look around the world, we've got a lot of countries which are becoming much more inward-looking. Particularly the United States, a lot of countries in Europe, be that the UK or even Germany or France. I mean, actually, perhaps one other thing which I think is very important, which we can't sort of go into too much depth to this week, was Germany's deal to basically secure 5 years worth of supply with a bilateral deal. I think we was in the region of 500 billion euros. With Trafigura, and that comes on top of all the other measures of pouring money into the economy, very much to France's annoyance and a lot of other countries. This is all inward looking. The world is becoming more fractured, and the world which is more fractured is clearly a world where demand for energy and demand for for global trade and commodities is not going to be as good.
And just picking up on that narrative, we also saw over the weekend on Friday the French president sort of critiquing the United States for its double standard, leaving Europe paying higher energy prices. I mean, some fractures emerging in this everyone for themselves moment, how that will impact perhaps the union around Russia and Ukraine.
Well, Sean, if there's one summary, not for the week, but for the last couple of months, it's been a very, very worrying trend of government interference in energy markets. And I think that's a theme that we should probably address separately in some other program, and you can separately address it because it's so important. It's just become normal to use SBR as a price control mechanism to subsidize prices, to try and put caps on prices, to do God knows what, to change benchmarks such as TTF. And that seriously worries me because most, I would say 9 out of 10 of those policies are actually asking for big problems, if not a disaster. And if we do get shortages of energy this winter in Europe, I think it will be purely due to politics and policies, silly policies being applied. Particularly, I'm worried about this idea of pushing for a price cap on gas that would almost certainly lead to shortages in Europe. So essentially, that's the main theme. You know, Macron, yes, and now of course politicians are running around headless, doing things they don't understand. Macron is having shortages of fuel in the country while subsidizing those same fuels at the same time. I mean, that's utter madness, utter madness. And then, you know, trying to criticize somebody else about energy policies is simply a joke. Start at home first. So I don't even know where to start, Sean. I mean, you could make an hour-long program just on these silly policies going on. And if there is a theme, that's a theme that's been going on for quite some time. And I'm not surprised you have such comments. We'll have more of them.
Mark, one of the sort of I don't know if it's a bright spot, but nonetheless seems to be defying gravity at the moment as the sort of global economic picture turns negative is India. Even under the weight of these sort of very high commodity and energy prices, India continues to see growth and defy that trend.
Yes, I mean, I think there's two aspects to that. The first one is actual domestic demand in India. If we're actually looking at consumer spending and business spending, despite this adverse trend, there is clearly a lot of benefit from people gradually moving to this view that India is ideally placed to replace, if you're going to invest abroad and you're still going to basically outsource your production, then India is the place to go. And I think it's definitely benefiting from that. I think the other aspect is actually we've got the Diwali holiday at the moment. And if you're actually looking at spending ahead of that, it's strongly up relative to 2019. And that is a measure of just how well the Indian economy is doing. It's still got a lot of catching up to do. There's still a lot of investment that is needed, but it's progressing in the right direction. And it is a big bonus. And I think also the fact that you've got all this strength in the GCC countries, it shouldn't actually be underestimated. They are between them, between India and the GCC, actually making quite a lot of difference to that big drag that we're obviously seeing from both Europe and indeed China.
Adi, just picking up on the earlier comment of government interference, I mean, the big one on the headlines continues to be this trying to agree on some form of oil cap, Russia oil price cap. And there was actually a dollar number floated over the weekend of $60. Your thoughts of where that's at? I mean, will this derail Europe's plans to boycott Russian oil in December 5th? Or is this viable? Your thoughts? They're still after it.
Absolutely, Sean. As I said last time I was in a program, you know, it is designed by Biden administration. The price cap has been designed by the administration in the United States to derail the European December 5 and later on for products February sanctions on Russian exports, because Biden is absolutely paranoid and totally committed to having low oil prices. And as a result, that's why we haven't seen actually much coming out. Actually, you know, we are supposed to be already implementing this price cap because people are already trading December loader crudes, well trading them, and we don't even know what's going on. And I think it's partly deliberate because essentially I think that the whole cap will be a non-event. And that's how it is likely to be designed. What will happen is that the cap will be set probably even above $60 a barrel, which is roughly where Russian crude trades anyway. So what we will have is, you know, essentially a bona fide sales of Russian crude and potentially even more Russian crude coming out than before, simply because they're now bona fide. They'll be not sanctioned. They'll be within some sort of price cap. And in theory, there'll be tough sanctions on Russia so that Putin doesn't make too much money, but in effect, as much oil will be coming out. So I think the plan of the US administration is just to keep business as usual.
Mark, we're going into another period of central bank meetings and possible rate hikes and so forth, starting in the coming days with the meeting in Europe. The European Central Bank widely expected to produce another turbo rate rise, a 75 basis point, maybe even more, given inflation in the European zone is above 10%. What is your outlook for that, this sort of next round of rate hikes, and where it will intersect with the current energy markets, with the current outlook for demand?
Right. Well, actually, just a quick passing point on the Russian thing. One thing
Please.
people should be keeping a close eye on is VLCC rates for shipping, because in contrast to everything else in the shipping sector, where container rates have literally and freight rates have collapsed because of weak demand, which is relevant to the growth question. VLCC rates are actually going through the roof. We got to $100,000 last week as a rate, which is amazing given a normal rate of about 20. So
and that what's pushing that? What's the?
I think it's basically what Adi was basically saying. The Russian oil will out, and people are actually trying to find ways to get it out, and that's putting upward pressure on tanker rates. So it is relevant, and it also basically also talks to a higher level for oil.
It pushes the, as I understand it, the geography around VLCCs. Instead of short journeys, you're now talking about big long journeys to Asia, and so consequently their commitment time wise is much greater than the past, and so availability then is restricted.
Yes, absolutely. But it sort of it means this displacement of Russian oil flows, which that probably represents, is actually just going to be, it means the supply will be there, but with OPEC plus cutting, even if it is rather nominal, when one actually looks at the detail of that cut, it leaves us with a market basically with an acute shortfall. And because we basically have this refinery problem, that we lost so much productive capacity during COVID, above all, and that can't be quickly rectified. You can't recreate refining capacity. Everyone's making a good effort at it, particularly in the GCC region, but it'll only gradually come on stream, and therefore that really also underpins the oil. But coming back to the central bank, we're looking. The key thing for the ECB this week is not necessarily the rate hike, which everyone expects to be 75 basis points. It's not even the signal for what they might do in December, which they seem to be sort of in the 50 to 75 area again. It is more about what they're going to do in terms of quantitative tightening. They've put it back on the table, or they've put it on the table for the first time. It probably won't happen till the second quarter of next year. But I think the whole point right now is, if we are going to have this Fed pivot, i.e. a move to basically slow down rate hikes and gradually stop, and perhaps in the longer run cut rates, I think that latter part is is far more questionable. The more important point for markets, and I think we're starting to see some of the signs of that, above all in equity markets, despite these occasional bear market rallies, is the withdrawal of all that liquidity which was put in above all during COVID. That actually always takes a long time to filter through into markets. We're only at month 2 at the moment of maximum Fed liquidity withdrawal. Generally, the impact on markets starts at months 3 to 6. And I'm sure for a lot of people, they're saying, well, haven't equity markets come down enough this and what happens if we do actually get a real recession? And I said, well, yes. So, it is that point where all the central banks withdrawing liquidity at the same time. And, we're going to have a hawkish Bank of Canada this week, even if they only hike by 50 basis points. The Fed is likely to hike by 75. So the message of hawkishness, trying to contain inflation, which they won't manage to do because it is a supply side problem, is basically this whole, it's very divisive pull for anyone, whether you're working in commodities, energy, or equities, or fixed income.
You're starting to see all the ingredients of that famous perfect storm as the winter digs in. Adi, on that point of the soaring back into the headlines last week was all things diesel, and whatever the Brent is doing, holding above 90. Yeah. But diesel at 200 is the big number. And that's the squeeze that could really deliver a crisis in terms of availability of supply.
Well, absolutely. We have low diesel stocks in the United States, a record low. Europe is not much better either. We're going into the winter. We actually have gas to oil switching, because actually oil is by far the cheapest fuel right now. You've got extremely expensive gas and coal, and oil is actually relatively cheap. So running diesel generators, it's a no-brainer, and that is one of the reasons why diesel is strong. I think Q4 will probably manage somehow. I think the key is Q1 and the weather and the winter and so on, and we'll see what happens. But most of us expect diesel cracks to go well over $40. This $40 a barrel for the crack is a magic number that we all kind of focused on. It's very, very high, but as Mark said, it's just something that needs to happen because of our limited refinery resources. In Europe, we've been closing refineries for years. We've got strikes in France at the moment. In fact, what also is kind of interesting and worrying in terms of as an early indicator for the economic situation in Europe is that I see North Sea oil actually moving out into Asia, which is extremely surprising, because what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 months is actually Gulf crude coming into Europe and actually Russian crude going into Asia. Now we're seeing Johan Sverdrup and Forties last 2 months on VLCCs going into Asia again, which is not, that's a good leading indicator, just saying something about European economy as well. So overall, it's a mess. But as you know, in the past, I haven't been particularly bullish a global economy anyway. And going back to the macro points that Mark mentioned, we know where the inflation is generally close to double digits in the West, and we know where the rates are, and we've got a long, long way to go to get the inflation down if we do want to get it down. And we know what happens if we don't get the inflation down. People take to the streets because the poor will probably get most hit by the high inflation rates. So it's hard to get terribly bullish, and I think OPEC saw it when they decided to cut by 1 million barrels. I think they disregarded
in the all for yourself sort of reality at the moment, where everybody is seeing that sort of nativist thing is probably heavily noted in that OPEC plus move. Let's just get the survey question and talk a little bit about the week ahead. China's Party Congress move towards more nativist policies will be bearish for oil demand in 2023. Agree, disagree, no impact. In some ways, Mr. Xi's doing the world a favor at the moment by being so muscular and nativist and not conceding on anything to do with COVID, which is an extraordinary. You've got very capable vaccines in the world to deliver for China as well as everybody else. It seems to me, if you're willing to buy Mercedes cars, why aren't you willing to buy Pfizer medicine? It just doesn't seem to make sense. Mark, I wanted to turn a little bit to it's like Trump, really. You cannot but help talking about it. Is it possible, and does it matter to the world if Boris Johnson returns to 10 Downing Street?
I think the most important message from Brexit, and this is probably not ever framed correctly, and I know that people who are pro-Brexit probably get upset if I say this, but the UK marginalised itself with that Brexit vote. The importance to the rest of the world, I think it's important because it's not important because of Johnson. It's important because what Ms. Truss tried to do was kickstart growth, and everyone in the financial markets rejected it. Whether that was right or wrong is a moot point. The point is, if we're going to have any government also stepping out of line, whether it's in Europe or the US or Asia, stepping out of line of conventional thinking, basically, they are probably going to meet with the same sort of fate as Ms. Truss's government. If in terms of Boris Johnson coming back, I think people will, get to the point where they just basically say, well, we're just not going to be able to count on the UK as part of the global trading community, which it makes it an even more challenging task for the UK. And I think that's the more significant part. In terms of what it means for global growth, I don't think it really has a lot of impact in the greater scheme of things.
Adi, your thoughts on the same question? Inevitably, it does seem a rather interesting moment, although that a moment existed a few weeks ago in the last election runoff for the Tories. You had obviously Rishi Sunak, which seems like a pretty responsible, balance the books kind of guy, versus Bojo and the recklessness of Truss, and which was essentially the same thing. And so Boris Johnson returning would seem, if you choose that as the Conservative Party, you're choosing more recklessness versus Rishi Sunak, which you might say is more soberness. Your thoughts, anyway, on where this goes
well,
next
a couple
week?
of things. If you just let me just come back to
Please.
one of Mark's points. I think Mark was being very, very kind to Liz Truss and all the other politicians. I think conventional would mean, I would instead of the word conventional mean just correct and normal policies, rather than reckless and dumb policies, okay, which she clearly did. I mean, her policies, the market punished them, even though the market players benefited personally. Market punished it because it just didn't make any economic sense. And she did study economics, funnily enough. I think I wish she studied chemistry like Maggie Thatcher. She probably would have done a lot better. So coming back to Richie, I do have a bit of a theory about it that hasn't been around very much. I don't think it's as you said, sort of Richie versus Boris now at all. Now I think it's completely different ball game. I think what's happening in the UK is that it's very, very obvious that to get ministers around the table, you don't have any heavyweights. So getting Boris back is very important to get some sort of face out there. But he's not going to be a prime minister. I would bet all my money that there was a meeting last night between Richie and Boris. Boris will announce full support for Richie to be a prime minister, which will be a right thing to do. And the thing I said last time when we were placing bets on who he's going to be, I always thought he was the right choice anyway. Safe pair of hands, safe economics, and so on. Market would benefit out of this and would reward that. In return, Boris is going to have a return to politics. And at the front line, with his face probably as a foreign minister or something like that. So I think that's a very likely scenario, and I think market would actually award such outcome pretty well, because I think they would be the best of both worlds. My theory, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, and it leads to my last point, because if he was to come back into that role, it would be, obviously he was got very big credit for his actions on Ukraine. But speaking of Ukraine, Mark, and Adi, last word, I'd like to get your thoughts on what the both of you are Central European, close there, and you have an awareness of how cold the winters are, and Putin is blowing the hell out of Ukraine's energy infrastructure at a very difficult moment in time. Your thoughts on that strategy and what sort of impact that's going to have, and the resistance of the Ukraine?
Well, he's resorted to what I call Syria tactics. This is a similar feature to what was done in Syria to basically, not bring peace, but basically put things into give control to the pro-Assad forces. And this is the same thing, basically destroying infrastructure. And it makes for a very, very difficult situation, because, the one thing, if people haven't got energy, if people if you can't move around on the roads, and if you can't actually produce anything, even the most basic things, it is coming to a point where you do wonder. I don't think the Ukrainians will, but you do wonder at what point they give up. And perhaps that's what he's trying to force. If we have a cold winter, obviously the situation is going to be made that much worse. But we are in this awkward period where actually a movement of ground forces, ground equipment is very difficult, because we are transitioning to winter. And I think that might also explain some of the tactic.
Adi, your thoughts? We'll get the
It's
survey result and we'll publish on social on that. But clearly, I mean, typically the hard winter, you'd think the conflict would stall for a while. But where does this go, do you think?
I think it's going to be, I mean, it clearly amounts to war crimes, in my opinion. I think it will make life for Ukrainians very hard. I don't disagree with Mark about anything he said, but I do think as we come to the winter, it will, that's exactly the Putin's plan, just to slow down the advance of Ukrainian forces and just to bring some sort of stalemate and just have a respite for his own forces.
And there's no counter punch to that, really, is there? Ultimately, the destruction of the energy infrastructure.
I think there is. I think that, you know, Ukraine and all the supporters of Ukraine, I think, can actually then continue and sort of hammer more Russian infrastructure, such as they did in Crimea. So there's every reason to do that now. So it doesn't make the war any better or closer to an end.
Well, it certainly stacks up for another interesting week. What will steal the headlines? And meanwhile, oil prices remain in the low 90s, looking again sort of drifting into nearly boring. And no matter what the dramas in the world, whether it's the China Congress and its sort of weird turn to Stalinist type postures, or the situation in Europe, oil seems to have found this steady place. Thank you both very much for rising early on a Sunday morning to join us and give us your thoughts on the week in review and the week ahead. Adi Insirovic and Mark Ostwald, really great to get your insights on all of these very big topics. Have a great week, everybody.